Hello everyone, it's Mostrino here. If you saw the last video, you would have seen that at the very end I talked about how in the next video, as in this one, I would be talking about mashing techniques. But I decided at like the very last second to switch the order around a little bit just because I realized that I feel like the stuff that I talk about in the mashing techniques video will make more sense if you've seen this video and the next video before it. So instead of having the mashing techniques video be number 3, now it's going to be video number 5, which means that the previous videos 4 and 5 are moved back one. So today we're going to be talking about stretching techniques, or in Ableton, the Ableton equivalent is warping. And I know Ableton has some modes that are different from FL Studio, so things are going to vary from DAW to DAW, but I do think that especially for FL Studio users, but also hopefully for users of other DAWs, there's some important information over here. So here we've got a send, and we already know by double clicking it we can get this guy popping up. And the first thing is that I mentioned in the first video that I was going to talk about the difference between this stretch mode and this stretch pro mode. And it does mention it a little bit in the top left, high quality real-time stretching versus elastic pro with format shifting. But I would imagine for a lot of people seeing this, those descriptions don't make a ton of sense. So let's just talk about stretching. I'm going to first talk about time stretching. So we've got this on stretch mode, and let's put it, say, at 140 BPM. And now when we play it, versus, of course, as we saw, the resample. Now you may or may not be able to notice that with the resample, listen especially to the drums versus the stretch. There's definitely a loss in quality. But it's like, well, we can't really do much about that, can we? Because if we use resample, the pitch change, doesn't it? Well, let's look at this Stretch Pro real quick as well. There is still a bit of a loss in quality, but if we compare it to Stretch, the Stretch Pro is a bit cleaner. Now let's take a look at pitch shifting. So this is where the main difference between Stretch and Stretch Pro comes in. And I think it'll be a lot easier to explain this difference if I use a vocal as the example. So let's say that I bring in this vocal from Rain by Astronaut. This is perfectly legal and free to use in the contest because it's available on their SoundCloud account. And this vocal is in 130 BPM and G sharp minor. So let's set this in 130 BPM. So first of all, let's hear how it sounds normally without any stretching.
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come.
Let's put it on stretch mode. Maybe we'll try speeding it up this time, putting it at 150, and hear how it sounds.
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come.
And then with the Stretch Pro mode,
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come.
maybe you can hear it, maybe you can't, but with the Stretch mode,
I've been holding on forever.
It's definitely a lower quality than the Stretch Pro.
I've been holding on forever.
In fact, I feel like for time stretching with all of, or at least almost all of the examples I've heard, Stretch Pro is either as good or better than the normal stretch mode. Of course, you feel free to try both just in case that ends up not being the case, but my personal recommendation is for time stretching, use the Stretch Pro. Now, what about this pitch shifting that I was talking about earlier? What if I try and pitch this down 3 on the stretch?
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come.
Whereas with the Stretch Pro mode,
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come.
So what this formant slider does, and this is the main difference between Stretch Pro and Stretch, is that the formant controls how deep or how high the voice sounds. Not necessarily in terms of pitch, but rather in terms of timbre. So if I leave this at 0 and I move this around, and you can automate this as well, you'll hear what it does.
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come. Who am I to just surrender? I'm not holding back for anyone.
So it controls, if it sounds like a deep voice or if it sounds like a chipmunk. So that means that when we turn it down 3, we have the option to preserve the formants, which means that it'll try its best to change the pitch without making it sound deeper. So again, normally.
I've been holding on forever.
And then -3.
I've been holding on forever.
Notice how it is kind of trying to not make it sound deeper. Whereas if we turn the formants to -300 cents, and you can see the amount in the top left here, this is what it sounds like.
I've been holding on forever,
which is what the normal Stretch mode does.
I've been holding on forever,
except the Stretch Pro mode does it in a little bit higher quality.
I've been holding on forever.
So especially for vocals, this Stretch Pro mode is extremely useful because it's tailored specifically for vocals, and it allows you to, control, do I really want this vocal to sound deeper, or do I just want it to change key? And we can also hear it work if we tried to pitch this up 3 and hear the difference.
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come. Who am I to just surrender?
Versus with the format shift or in Stretch.
I've been holding on forever, waiting for the rain to come.
So it's a very useful tool if you're pitching vocals around but you still want them to sound quote unquote natural. But as far as for full tracks like Ascend here, since the format control is tailored towards vocals, it usually does not work as well for full tracks. So if I pitch this up 3, usually you'll get better results pitching the formant up 300 cents as well. Notice how the tonality is preserved much more than when the format shift is set to 0. Or even if I had pitched it down, the effect would be even more obvious. In my experience, the Stretch Pro mode essentially always beats out the Stretch mode, but be careful when you're pitching full tracks. You're going to want to make sure that you shift this formant by the same amount as well, so that you don't get any problems in that regard. But even with this Stretch Pro mode, the fact of the matter is that even the Stretch Pro mode, while it's a big improvement over the Stretch mode, even the Stretch Pro mode is not as clean as the resample. So what can we do about this? The first thing that I should bring up right off the bat is to just not use the Stretch mode when you don't have to. Like if your track's already in the right key and the right BPM, leave it on resample because that's going to give you higher quality. So if your track is playing by itself, there's no reason to have it on Stretch mode. Just make sure you got your BPM automation so that it gets to the right tempo, and then just put it on resample. Another example is whenever you're doing a mashup, you should always be able to have at least one of the tracks be on resample, because if you're using multiple tracks, there's nothing stopping you from setting the BPM to one of the tracks that's already in key, and then you can have at least that one on resample. For example, if you're doing like an acapella mashup, keeping the instrumental on resample, you can stretch the acapella, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, but keeping the instrumental on resample and not stretching that one will greatly increase the quality of your mixes. And I'm not just talking about quality as in how good they are, but rather like the actual audio fidelity. Now, I should mention that there are some cases where you absolutely have to use Stretch, like what I mentioned in the last video, where if you're doing a BPM transition, a tempo automation, you're gonna have to use stretch because there's no way with resample to keep it on sync. Well, there is one way, which is if I set this to stretch so that the time knob's working and I set it back to resample, and then I do this BPM automation and I bring it from 150 to say 170, it's gonna stay synced with the project, but you're gonna notice that the pitch change. So there is a way to do BPM automations without keeping it on stretch, but as you notice, the pitch changed as well. So that's usually not going to be what you're going for. So in all of the cases that I've encountered, at least, when you're doing a BPM automation, you're going to have to put it on stretch. But what you could do is you have it on stretch here, and maybe we're going from, let's say instead of going from 150 to 170, let's say we're going from 140 to 150. So what we can do in this case is, we know we need to have it on stretch in here, but here we can use the cut tool, right click this little waveform here, click make unique or hit M, and now when we double click this one, we can put this one on resample. So it's still on resample, it's unstretched during the drop, but we can still do that tempo automation. And another tip is, maybe it's in your interest to make this tempo automation be done quicker so that you can have it on resample for longer. Maybe something like this. So you can minimize the amount that you have to stretch. Now I'm going to talk about some techniques that you can use to either limit the quality decrease of stretching or avoid stretching altogether. Because one of the things that I mentioned is that with stretching, the biggest thing that gets impacted is usually the drums. So the first tip is that you can use either stem drums or your own drums and replace these drums with those so that even though the track itself is stretched, you can still get clean, high quality drums. I'll just do a really quick example with some cymatics drums. You select the area where you want to do the side chain, and there's ways to do side chaining without using automation clips, and I usually use those methods in my own original tracks. But as far as mixes and mashups, I find that automation clips are usually just the easiest because they're really simple to set up, and then you can do something like this. And here's another tip for the FL users. If you select this area right here, right click somewhere on here so that it still has this area selected but these aren't highlighted red. Hit E on your keyboard to get the selection tool. Click and drag over the area you want to duplicate and hit Control B. It's going to duplicate them like this. So now it's really easy to kind of extend this beat pattern. So here's without. And then with. So there's still definitely an audio quality decrease, but at least you can keep the drums high quality. Another thing to keep in mind is knowing how far should you push stretch, because obviously, of course you don't want to stretch when you don't have to, but when you have to stretch, how far can you push it? Well, you know, if you ask different people, you might get different answers. I'll say from my experience and from my perspective. You know, if you look at my mixes and at my mix contest submission, you should know that it's very rare for me to change the key of any of my instrumentals. I might change the key of the acapellas because the thing is with stems and acapellas, the stretch modes tend to work much better because they only have to worry about one element. When you're trying to stretch something that's, you know, consisting of a bunch of different elements doing a bunch of different things at once, you know, you might set up the stretch mode so that it works really well for one of those elements, but then it's not going to work as well for some of the other elements. So you can generally push stretching for acapellas and stems a lot further than you can for tracks. So I'm going to say how far I push it for tracks, and then I'll say how far I push it for acapellas. So for tracks, like I mentioned, I rarely ever change the pitch. And as far as BPM differences go, usually if I'm changing the BPM of tracks, I would do something like this where I'm fixing up the drums and making sure that the drums aren't causing problems. And I might use some other techniques to decrease the amount that I'm stretching, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. As far as acapellas go, those, especially with the Stretch Pro mode now, you can usually change them pretty far. And usually the level that I stop isn't necessarily because of the sound quality, but rather just because of it sounding unnatural. You know, if you pitch it up a certain amount, it starts just kind of sounding weird, right? Or if you make it so much faster or so much slower, then it can really throw you off. So those, you know, once it gets to the point where it's like, wow, this sounds pretty weird, it sounds, you know, that's probably the point where you should stop and maybe dial it back a bit. But for as far as quality issues go, of course, you know, it's always better to keep things on resample, but I'm usually not concerned about that at all as far as acapellas go, because as long as I have the instrumental on resample, I can do some stretching with the acapellas and still have it at a good enough quality, thanks to the Stretch Pro mode and thanks to the fact that, you know, these stretch modes tend to work much better for acapellas. Although something that I should mention with the Stretch Pro mode is that if your vocal stem has maybe multiple vocals playing at the same time, you know, some sort of harmony or some effects on it, it might not work as well as it does with the dry vocal like the Rain one that I showed you. So keep that in mind, you know, just something to keep in mind, that it just kind of depends on the vocal sample itself. So now the second to last thing that I want to talk about really quickly is using chopping to avoid stretching. So let's set this tempo back to 150, which means that I don't need to have a send on stretch because it's already in the right BPM. And let's say I want to do a mashup with I'll Fight Back by Sullivan King. And I'll talk a little bit more about these mashup techniques in the mashup techniques video. And again, track selection is something that's very important to keep in mind here, because obviously the further that you need to go for these tips, you know, if you're taking a track that's like 50 BPM difference and is in like the complete opposite side in terms of keys, some of these techniques are going to stop working because you're just going to have to do so much to get it in the right time or in the right key. So what I'm trying to do right now is I'm just kind of trying to expand the range of tracks that you can use without having to worry about stretching. But I'm definitely not saying that you can just put any tracks together regardless of the key and the BPM. Obviously you can stretch them, but especially for something like the mix contest, if you're stretching tracks that heavily, it can end up very problematic for you. So be smart about track selection, because right here I've got a send and I'll Fight Back, and these tracks are in the same key, so I'm not having to do anything in terms of pitch. But the difference here is that this is in 150 and I'll Fight Back is in 155. So we've got two options. One is we can stretch I'll Fight Back to be in 150. Let's find where the drop is. And here's how it sounds like if we use Stretch Pro and type in 155. It's not the worst artifacts in the world because we're only stretching it by 5 BPM, but we can get away without stretching it at all, which will make it even higher quality. And what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna have it on stretch for now, but I'm gonna unstretch it afterwards. And I'm just gonna cut between these tracks really quickly, and I'll talk more about doing cuts in the mashup techniques video. So I'm not gonna talk about that right now, I'm just gonna do it really quickly for the sake of the example. So I just cut these together really quickly, sounds like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to chop these individual samples, and there's actually a shortcut to doing this. If you right click here, go into chop, time based, maybe we do chop in beats. So let's just go ahead and chop these, and one more over here. And now I'm going to put this back on resample, and you'll notice that it's a bit short. So now here's where we're going to be extending the clips a little bit. And to prevent clicking, we're going to turn on this zero crossing here. And basically what that does is that's going to make sure that when I connect these two, they connect at points like these where the waveform is at zero amplitude, which should minimize the amount of popping that we get. So if I do something like this, and then maybe I just select all of these other ones and do the same thing. As you can see, the zero crossing didn't let me extend this one as much as I wanted, so sometimes you gotta be on the lookout for stuff like that. And I'm just gonna do this really quickly with the rest of these clips. And we might need to extend the beginning of Ascend here, just because notice how this one cuts off. So we'll see how that sounds. And now when we play it, and now let me compare it real quickly to how it would have sounded if we did stretch. So here's the stretched one. And here's the unstretched one. Now it might be hard to hear, but I can tell you that the unstretched one is definitely cleaner. And you know, I do that all the time now for when I'm doing mashups with a bunch of tracks and each one maybe only has like a bass shot or a growl and they might not be in the right key or BPM. You know, just chopping them real quickly like this allows you to avoid stretching them, and especially for those bass shots and growls, especially like those really compressed growls, even just a little bit of stretching can really make a difference on the quality. So keeping that in mind. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly in terms of stretching that I'll go over. And this is thanks to actually Duality for telling me about this. I wouldn't have thought about it without it. But when you're doing, you know, like a small BPM change, like let's say I'm going from 127 BPM to 130. If you do the automation like this, remember that during these tempo automations, unless you want to change the pitch, you're going to have to put stuff in stretch. But if you have a really small BPM change like this, like less than 5 BPM difference, then if you just do something like this, paste this one here, and maybe paste the 131 here, and just have it see how it's just cutting straight from one to the other, then you never have to put both of them on stretch. And you can just switch BPM immediately, and since it's such a small difference, people aren't going to notice. Being able to avoid stretching in any way you can is absolutely going to help improve the audio quality of the mix. So overall, I would say probably the biggest takeaways is, first of all, probably Stretch Pro mode is going to be your best friend over the original stretch mode if you do need to stretch things. And also, track selection is going to be your best friend as well, making sure, you know, I don't want to restrict you to having to have every single track in the same key or having every single track in the same BPM, but be smart about it, right? But for sure, you always want to have at least one track that's unstretched aside from during tempo automations, but also thinking about if you can minimize the amount of stretching you're doing overall. And again, for acapellas, for vocals, it doesn't really matter that much. But if you've got like a bass shot that's coming in, you know, it's just coming in for a brief period of time, then you can usually use the chopping technique to chop that sample around and get it in time without having to worry about using stretching. And also remembering, you know, maybe using your own drums if you do have to stretch a track, or using the stem drums from that track, which I'm going to talk about stemming in the next video. That can also help improve the quality just a little bit. So as I just mentioned, in the next video I'm going to be talking about stems actually, and then it'll be in the following video that I talk about mashing techniques. Again, if the video shows up as unavailable, it should be going up tomorrow. And then again, if you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, join the Discord server. I will link it in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.